And today I decided to bring this video, which is going to be me explaining to you guys how testing works in React in a very short amount of time, because I feel like a lot of people get confused in the beginning. And for that reason, I wanted to try to simplify testing as much as I can, because it is simple. You just got to understand what you're supposed to do and what you're supposed to test. So for that reason, I decided to bring this video. And before we get into the video, if you could leave a like and subscribe, I would massively appreciate it. It would help support my channel and bring more people to my channel, which I would be very grateful for if you could do that. And yeah, that's basically it. Let's get into the video. Okay everyone, so in order to show you guys how to test in React, we're going to be testing a specific component that has a lot of different parts to it. So the component, it's actually called a counter. You'll see over here, it's this component over here. It's very simple, it's just a counter app, and I chose this one because despite it being a simple app, which is just a count, it's actually pretty interesting to test because it introduces a lot of the different topics that you need to understand when testing. So I thought it would be a good idea to use this as an example. So you can see our component is pretty simple. It's just called counter, and it's just a component that it creates a state called count, which starts with an initial count, which comes from a prop, but usually you can start from 0, whatever you want, but basically it starts with that value. And then we have a couple buttons over here that does some stuff to that count, right? So we have a button that calls this function called increment, which increments the value of the count, so it increases the state. We have one which decrements, it decreases the value. One that restarts, meaning it just sets the number to 0. And then one which kind of just switches signs. If it's negative, it becomes positive. If it's positive, it becomes negative. And this is the app right here, right? Very simple. We can just click on the button, it will keep increasing. If we click on decrement, it will decrease. We can restart, we can switch the signs, become negative, become positive, whatever we want. So this app is simple, but it serves as a good example to explain how to test. So why would we want to test this? Well, because there's different aspects of the component that depend on how the user is interacting with the component. So what do I mean by that? Well, this text over here, it should change, right? It's displaying the count, so it should change depending on what the user does with the buttons, right? So this would be a good thing to test because sometimes, and I swear this happens a lot, we as a developer, we think our code makes sense, we think our code works, but when you deploy the code, trust me when I say that millions of people will use this code or your product in millions of different ways, which eventually one of the ways they use it will cause issues. So you want to be testing all the edge cases so that you're really sure that what you wrote covers every possible use case. So unit testing is important because in some sense, it takes more time for you to go ahead and write a test for this component when you're done with it, right? But at the same time, if there's an issue with it, which again, it happens a lot, you won't have to come back and debug everything because you found the issue before you even deploy the application, right? So testing is important for that reason. So how would I test a component like this in React? Well, you might expect that in React, when you install or you do a create React app, you see this file over here, which is called setup tests. This file, its main purpose is just to import, as you can see, Jest DOM, which will allow us to use a lot of different interesting functions when we're trying to test. You'll see it is really important. So it's nice that it already comes with the create React app boilerplate. Now, usually it also comes with a test file called app.test.js, but what I want to do is, whenever you have a new test you want to write, what you do is you just create a file with the name of the file, so counter, and then .test.js. This is a common practice for this, right? You don't have to do it exactly this way. I always recommend grouping your files, your testing files with your normal files together in a folder or something like that. But it is important that they're next to each other so that when you're testing, you can look at the other file, and also it makes your code more organized. So over here, inside of our counter.test.js, we want to start by importing our counter component over here. Now, whenever we're testing a component, we import it because what we want to say is each test or each test file that you create should represent a test for a specific component. And what you're doing is you're describing all the different stuff that can happen to that component. So one way to write tests in React would be to first say you're describing the counter component, like this. Now, if you don't know what the describe function is, it's just one of the ways to start a test in React and in JavaScript in general as well. You can use other ways. You can use tests like this. I would recommend trying out every possible way to test. I'm going to link some resources in the description of some articles explaining best practices when testing and everything like that. Because it is everyone tests differently. As long as you're covering your code and you're testing effectively, then that's fine. But everyone writes tests in a different way. This is how I write tests, and I feel like it's a good way to do it. So what you do first is you describe this component, right? So you write a describe. And inside of here is where you put all of the individual tests that can happen with this component. Now, how do you write an individual test? Well, you use the it function because you're describing this component, and what you're describing is you put over here. So what do I want to describe for the counter component? Well, the first thing I want to test is, first of all, this counter component over here has an initial count, right? It's just a prop that we pass wherever we call it. We can make it 5, and then you'll see that if I refresh the page, it starts at 5 instead of 0. I set it as 0 because it makes more sense. But what I want to test initially is if I render this component and pass 5 or 6 as the initial count, will this be displayed? This is important because we're testing how the component is handling its props, right? So we could do something like this. We could say counter displays correct initial count or something like this, right? This message, some people will complain, I know, of how I describe this, but honestly, write whatever makes sense to you and write exactly what is happening in this test. So what I'm going to do in this test is I'm going to test to see if it is displaying the correct count. So I'll just come over here and I'm going to just put a callback function that will describe what action will occur inside of this test. So basically, whenever we're describing an actual test, right? So whenever we are instantiating our component, creating a test version of our component and testing to see if all of the stuff that we want to test actually works, we need to use a function from the React testing library called the render function. So I'm going to say const over here. I'm going to open and close curly braces. I'm going to set it equal to render, and it will automatically import over here, as you can see. Now, this render function, it serves to render kind of a fake version of your component. Inside of it, you'll just put the component that you want to test. You can input over here all the props that you want to initiate this component with that are going to be useful for this specific test. So I'm going to initiate this with the value 0, right? And then what I want to do is I want to grab some stuff directly from this new version of our component. What are some stuff you can actually grab from it? One of the things we can get is a function that will serve for us to find elements inside of our component. So if I want to test to see if this number over here is equal to 5, right? The way I do this is I need to query this specific element inside of here. And there's many different ways to get this element or query this element. And the different ways are represented by different functions that you can get directly from this render function over here. So for example, if you write get over here, you'll see all the different functions that you can use to find an element. You can get an element by its text, you can get it by its title, its row, its display value, so many different ways. And it's also an important distinction that you can use a query as well. Now, the difference between get and query is that if I try to get, for example, an element, a button from my component, if there's no buttons in my component, it will fail my test. Now, there are some cases in which we don't want that to happen. For example, if we have a condition where sometimes it should show the button and sometimes it shouldn't show the button, we want to be able to test the case in which it doesn't show the button. So we'll use the query in that case because it would just return null, which means our test should be working. Now, in our case over here, we want to use the get because there's no way there won't be any count inside of our app, right? It should really fail if there's no count. So we're gonna use the get type function. Now, which of them are we gonna choose? Well, you should read the documentation to read each one of them. I'm not going to go over each one of them individually. I'm going to use some of them, but not all. But there's one over here, which is the get by test ID. Now, all of the functions have a different version of them. They have a version called all, which is just in case you have multiple elements with the same, with similar identifiers. But we're going to be using the normal one, which is get by test ID. And this function over here, it serves for elements which are dynamically changing. So in our case over here, we have a count that will be constantly changing its value. So we wouldn't be able to grab by text because the text inside of this h3 tag will be changing consistently, right? The number is changing. So in this kind of situations, we would be able to use the get by test ID. Now, this is a very easy one to use because all you have to do is you just have to come over here to the element you want to get. You say data test ID like this, and you just pass a value, right? For example, I can say count. And then over here, if I want to grab whatever is inside of here, I can just say const, for example, count value is equal to get by test ID and pass count over here. Now, the thing is, you shouldn't overuse this. You should only use data test ID for situations like this in which there's no other way to get this individual value. But in this case, it is useful, so that's why we're using it. And what we want to test in this specific test is if whatever value we passed as a prop over here will actually be displayed inside of this h3 tag, which is now represented by this little thing over here. Now, this is not the actual value. What this is just whatever, it's just the h3 tag. To access the value, we would have to say something like get by test ID dot text content or whatever. You can access so many things of the actual DOM element, right? So we're just accessing whatever is inside of this element. And also, it is important to recognize that this will come out as a string. So if we were to actually test to see if this is equal to 0, all we have to do is we have to formulate our test as following. We should say that we expect something to happen, and then we say what would we expect it to be, right? So we can say we expect it to be something, or we can say expected to equal something. There's like so many different functions that you can use. You can say to have length if it is an array and you want to test to see if the length of that array is correct. There's many different functions you can use, but the important part is this one over here, where you just start by saying you expect something to happen. So what do we expect to happen? We expect that the count value over here is equal to 0 because this is the initial count we pass. Now, how would we test this over here? Well, if you want to run your test in React, there's a script automatically implemented which allows you to just run yarn test in your terminal, and it will start running all of your tests. And whenever you make any changes to your tests, it will automatically update and run the tests again. Now, you see, I failed one of the tests, and this is an important thing I wanted to say. This shows over here issues that our app can have, right? Because initially, our thing over here, we're testing to see if it is equal to 0, but the content we get from the element is not a number, and 0 is a number. So this minor stuff is important to test because sometimes you think something is a specific type, and sometimes it's not. So in our case over here, how would we make this work? Well, we could just convert this number or this text we get from the element into a number. And now our test will pass because now we're comparing two numbers instead of a number and a string. So this is great. We just wrote our first test, which is amazing. So what do we do now? Well, we just write more and more tests. So we tested just an initial count, right? Like whatever it is when we render the component. Now let's test to see what happens if you click on one of the buttons. More specifically, let's test the
Being agile is essential in modern software development and testing. Did you know you could improve time to market by as much as 20%, increase team productivity up to 95%, and reduce development costs by 29%? Now you can with X-Ray, a cutting-edge test management solution that integrates with Jira, the #1 software development tool used by agile teams. With X-Ray, close the gap between your testing and development teams. Deliver high-quality software, better and faster than ever, with total confidence. X-Ray allows you to create, organize, and execute tests, Plan your testing strategy. Integrate with leading automation frameworks. Integrate with CI/CD platforms. Report and ensure all of the features are tested. Creating tests is easy with X-Ray's intuitive user interface. X-Ray relates your requirements in Jira with test cases and provides test coverage visibility over your projects. With X-Ray, you can execute manual tests right from Jira, import automated executions, and write BDD specifications with Gherkin. X-Ray's full REST API gives you unmatched integration possibilities. Our native support for CI/CD tools and test automation frameworks empowers your teams to find and fix problems sooner. As your testing efforts scale, X-Ray scales with you. Organize your tests into a hierarchy of folders to improve execution and visibility of results. Once you define your test strategy and scope, create a test plan to track the status of your executions, requirements, and overall readiness to deploy. Requirements traceability, visibility, and well-defined KPIs take your reports and dashboards to the next level. X-Ray's reports and gadgets empower you with live data so you can make smart decisions. Our mobile app lets you take X-Ray's insights everywhere you go. Never deliver broken or untested code again. More than 4.5 million testers, developers, and QA managers trust X-Ray. See why over 5,000 companies consider X-Ray a mission-critical tool. Check for yourself.
Increment button. So what description would I write over here? I would say counter or count should increment by 1 if the increment button is clicked, right? Obviously, again, the way you describe your tests by using multiple, if you could actually use more describes if you want. It's just